The Broom and the Embers. The night shift at the orbital docking ring above New Carthage Station was a place of echoes. Not loud ones, never loud. The great commercial rush of daylight hours had long since faded. The thunder of cargo loaders, the clipped urgency of command officers, the constant murmur of interstellar commerce, all of it receded into memory when artificial dusk settled across the ring. Illumination panels dimmed to a softer spectrum. Foot traffic vanished. The corridors became long corridors of silver and shadow. Ilia's row preferred it that way. Above the slow curve of the station, the stars stretched endlessly, cold and indifferent. From the observation windows he polished each night, the universe looked serene, beautiful, even. But Elias had long ago learned that beauty in space was often just violence seen from far enough away. He pushed his janitorial cart down corridor C12, the wheels humming softly over the seamless alloy floor. His uniform bore the modest insignia of the Terran Stellar Union's Civilian Maintenance Division, functional gray fabric, reinforced knees, tool loops stitched along the belt. Nothing about it suggested importance. Nothing about him did either. And he liked that. Invisibility was freedom. Admirals strode past him without meeting his eyes. Corporate negotiators stepped around him as though he were part of the wall. Diplomats from half a dozen species had brushed by while he buffed floors, their conversations drifting over his bowed head. He heard things, he remembered things, but no one ever thought to guard their words around a man holding a mop. He had become very good at listening. Tonight, the ring felt unusually still. Docking schedules had been light, just 2 civilian freighters and 1 diplomatic courier ship from Varkesh Prime cleared through customs with an armed escort. That last one had drawn attention. Dragons did not travel casually. Elias dipped his mop into the cleaning solution, wrung it out with steady, practiced hands and began sweeping wide arcs across the floor. The motion was rhythmic, almost meditative. Push, pull, turn, step. His mind wandered, as it often did during these long hours. He thought about the stars, about Earth blue and distant and increasingly abstract, about how a boy who once watched rockets from a polluted shoreline had somehow ended up maintaining an orbital ring in deep space. Life did not move in straight lines. It spiraled, it adapted. He finished corridor C12 and checked his datapad. Docking Bay 12 required inspection, post-departure sanitation, and manifest verification. Routine. He pushed his cart onward. Docking Bay 12 was cavernous, its ceiling arching high enough to swallow entire freighters. The bay doors were sealed now, transparent shielding revealing only a ribbon of distant starlight beyond. Cargo pallets had been cleared, clamps disengaged, docking conduits retracted. All that remained were faint scorch marks from thrusters and a handful of forgotten crates awaiting catalog correction. Elias entered the bay and let the quiet settle around him. He always paused in the bays. There was something about standing inside a chamber built to embrace ships, massive interstellar vessels that pierced the dark between suns, that humbled him. These spaces were thresholds. Beginnings and endings lived here. He began his inspection. A toppled crate near the loading line, a smear of lubricant near the refueling port, a dented cargo container pushed slightly out of alignment near the far wall. He frowned. That container hadn't been on the standard grid layout. He checked his datapad and cross-referenced the manifest. The crate's tag blinked into view, DECOMMISSIONED Thermal Regulator PARTS, hold for disposal. He looked up again. The crate was scuffed, its alloy surface dented along one edge as if dropped in haste. One corner bore a faint blackening burn residue. Elias felt a small prickle at the back of his neck. Thermal regulators didn't burn from the inside. He pushed his cart closer, movement slow, deliberate. He crouched beside the container and rested his palm lightly against the metal surface. Warm. Not the residual warmth of machinery recently powered down, not ambient heat from station climate control. A live warmth. He held his breath. There it was again. A flicker. Not visible light, more a pulse felt through the alloy, a gentle thrum like a heartbeat beneath steel. And then, a sound. Soft. Almost too soft to register in the vastness of the bay. A purring vibration. Elias blinked. Thermal regulators did not purr. He stood slowly, glanced around the docking bay, and confirmed what he already knew. He was alone. Night shift rotations placed the nearest security patrol 9 minutes away. The bay's primary cameras covered the main cargo lanes, not the shadowed edge where this crate rested. He reached for his mop handle and used it to nudge the crate. The lid shifted. Not locked. That more than anything else made his pulse quicken. Decommissioned parts were sealed for radiation safety, always. He swallowed once, then slid the lid open. Warmth spilled out like breath from a furnace. Inside lay a creature curled tightly upon itself, wrapped in insulating foam and shredded packing fabric. For a moment, Elias' mind refused to interpret what his eyes were seeing. Scales, copper-bright and iridescent, overlapping in delicate patterns that caught the dim light and refracted it into molten hues. A slender tail coiled protectively around a small, compact body. Wings folded tight against its spine, membranes thin and translucent like burnished glass. Smoke drifted faintly from its nostrils. The creature stirred. Its eyes opened. Gold. Not metallic gold, not reflective gold. Living gold. Elias forgot to breathe. It was a dragon hatchling. He had seen dragons only twice in person. Once during a heavily secured diplomatic reception, where adult Varkeshian envoys had towered above human officials like living statues of flame and stone. Once through a reinforced viewport as a dragon cruiser maneuvered into orbit, its hull shaped in sweeping curves that mimicked wings. But this was small. Fragile. The hatchling could not have been more than a few weeks old by Terran developmental standards. No larger than a housecat, though denser in build. Its chest rose and fell rapidly, each breath faintly steaming the cool air of the docking bay. It looked at him. Not with aggression. Not with territorial warnings. With exhaustion. A tremor ran through its body, subtle but unmistakable. Elias noticed the tear in its right wing membrane, ragged along the edge. Several scales along its flank were blackened and cracked. Plasma scoring. Someone had fired on it. The thought ignited anger before he could stop it. Who shoots at something this small? The hatchling shifted, attempting to rise. It managed only a weak lift of its head before sagging back into the foam. A thread of flame flickered from its mouth, brief and sputtering, more reflex than threat. Elias slowly set his mop aside. He raised both hands, palms open. "I'm not going to hurt you," he murmured. He knew dragons understood human language at advanced cognitive levels once matured. Hatchlings were less certain, but tone transcended vocabulary. The golden eyes watched him closely. There was intelligence there. Not simple animal awareness. Awareness of him. He crouched lower. "All right," he said softly, forcing calm into his voice. "You picked the wrong janitor if you're looking for someone important." The hatchling blinked. Its pupils narrowed slightly. It made a small sound, high and strained. Not a roar. A whimper. And then something happened that Elias would later struggle to describe in reports, interviews, and official debriefings. A sensation brushed against his mind. Not invasive, not forceful. Tentative, like the faintest warmth against cold skin. A concept formed not in words, not in language, but in pure emotional clarity. Shelter. Elias froze. Dragons possessed low-band empathic resonance capabilities. Classified information circulated discreetly among Union leadership. The ability strengthened with age, used for coordination in flight and diplomacy. Hatchlings were not supposed to project. This one did. Shelter. The feeling came again, weaker this time. He swallowed hard. "You're in trouble," he said quietly. The hatchling's eyes dimmed slightly, not losing their glow but softening. Confirmation. Elias glanced toward the entrance of docking bay 12. His datapad vibrated gently against his hip, ticking down routine station timing. Security patrol would pass the outer corridor in 9 minutes. He had worked this ring for 5 years. He knew every blind spot, every camera angle, every maintenance hatch. He looked back at the hatchling. He could close the crate, seal it, alert security, report a potential diplomatic crisis. It would be the responsible action. He would be commended for vigilance. He would go home at the end of his shift and sleep knowing he had followed procedure. The hatchling's breathing hitched. Smoke curled weakly from its nostrils. Shelter. The wordless plea pressed against him again, faint, flickering like a dying ember. Elias exhaled slowly. Procedure had never once looked at him the way those golden eyes did. He reached up and unzipped his maintenance jacket. The fabric was heat-resistant, standard issue for hull maintenance zones. He slid it off carefully and draped it over his forearms. "All right," he whispered, "all right." He leaned forward slowly, giving the hatchling time to react. It tensed at first, claws flexing weakly against the foam, but when his hand slipped beneath its small body, it did not strike. It was heavier than he expected. Warm. Not burning, but deeply, powerfully warm, as though he held a piece of living sunstone. He wrapped the jacket around it gently, mindful of the torn wing. The hatchling released a faint rumbling sound, lower now steadier. Relief. Elias stood, cradling the bundled dragon against his chest. Heat seeped through the jacket into his shirt, into his skin. He didn't let go. "All right, little Ember," he murmured, "let's get you somewhere safe." He moved quickly but without running. Panic drew attention, calm passed unnoticed. He reached his cart and triggered a maintenance override on the bay's secondary lighting. For exactly 12 seconds, the illumination grid flickered, routine voltage fluctuation, logged and dismissed by central systems. During those 12 seconds, the docking bay cameras glitched. No one ever figured out why. When the lights stabilized, docking bay 12 was empty. Only a dented crate remained, lit ajar, cooling slowly in the artificial night. Fire in the maintenance shafts. Elia's Rose apartment was not listed on any official housing manifest. On paper, the space between Water Recycling Unit 7 Gamma and Atmospheric Processor 3 Delta was designated as Structural Buffer and Overflow Conduit Access. In reality, it was a narrow maintenance cavity large enough to fit a cot, a folding table, a storage locker, and one stubborn human who preferred silence over comfort. It smelled faintly of ionized air and treated water, clean, metallic, alive with the steady hum of systems that kept 30,000 souls breathing. Elias liked the hums. It meant the station was functioning, it meant nothing catastrophic was happening, it meant he could rest. He had carved out the space years ago, unofficially but not illegally. Maintenance supervisors had noticed, of course. They had also noticed that since Elias began living adjacent to the processors, emergency response times for system irregularities had dropped by 12%. No one asked questions. And now the space housed more than just him. The dragon hatchling fit inside an old storage cabinet Elias had emptied and lined with insulation foam, spare rags, and a folded thermal blanket. He had cut ventilation slits into the cabinet door and reinforced the interior with heat-resistant plating scavenged from a scrapped panel. It was crude, but it was warm. For 2 days, nothing happened. No security sweep, no official bulletin about missing cargo, no emergency directive instructing maintenance personnel to report unusual biological findings. The station continued as always, ships docking, supplies unloading, politics murmuring through corridors like distant thunder. Inside the narrow apartment, however, change unfolded quietly. The hatchling healed. Elias had expected slow recovery, perhaps even deterioration. Plasma scoring was not minor damage. He had seen what directed energy weapons did to hull plating. Organic tissue should not have recovered so cleanly. Yet by the end of the first day, the blackened scales along the hatchling's flank had begun to flake away, revealing brighter copper beneath. By the second, the tear in its wing membrane had sealed into delicate bronze lace, stronger and more symmetrical than before. It fascinated him. Dragons were known for biological resilience, but witnessing it firsthand was something else entirely. The creature's metabolism radiated controlled heat, its body functioning like a fusion reactor in miniature, self-contained, efficient, relentless. The hatchling followed him with curious eyes wherever he moved in the cramped quarters. When he brewed reconstituted coffee on his small thermal unit, it watched the steam rise with intense focus. When he disassembled a filter valve for cleaning, it leaned closer, sniffing at the scent of metal and lubricant. When he spoke, rambling commentary about pressure regulators or complaining about bureaucratic inefficiencies, it tilted its head as if parsing meaning from cadence. "You don't understand a word of this," Elias told it on the second evening, scrubbing his hands with industrial cleanser. The hatchling blinked slowly. A faint pulse brushed against his mind. Not words, but recognition. He froze. "You do, don't you?" he murmured. The golden eyes narrowed slightly, not threatening but thoughtful. Dragons matured cognitively at astonishing speeds. That much he knew from overheard briefings. Their neural architecture supported accelerated pattern recognition and empathic communication. This one was learning him. And he, despite himself, was growing attached. He caught himself smiling more often, talking more, moving slower around the room so as not to startle it. He should not have allowed that. On the third night, the alarms began. The sound tore through the station with brutal urgency, docking sirens rising in layered waves of red alert frequencies. The hum of processors shifted pitch as systems rerouted power to defensive grids. Overhead lights snapped from soft white to emergency amber. Ilya stood instantly. The hatchling recoiled inside the cabinet nest, smoke curling instinctively from its nostrils. Security broadcasts crackled over the intercom system. Unauthorized boarding vessel detected. All personnel proceed to lockdown positions. Diplomatic breach protocol in effect. Diplomatic breach. Elias felt his stomach drop. He crossed the small space in 3 strides and activated the wall display. Static flickered before resolving into a live feed from the outer docking perimeter. A ship hovered beyond the station's defensive array. It was unlike Terran vessels, sleek yet organic, its hull curved in sweeping arcs reminiscent of folded wings. Light pulsed faintly along etched channels across its surface, like veins of magma beneath stone. And emblazoned across its forward plating was a sigil Elias recognized from security briefings. A star encircled by living flame. The crest of the Varkeshian High Brood. His throat went dry. The feed shifted to a close-up transmission. A towering figure filled the screen. She stood taller than any human by half again, her scales deep crimson edged with obsidian. Wings folded behind her like cloaks of shadow. Horns curved elegantly from her skull, framing eyes that glowed with contained stellar fury. High Matriarch Sorinth of Varkesh Prime. Her voice resonated through the broadcast not merely as sound, but as vibration, a harmonic undertone that thrummed in Elias' bones even through digital transmission. Our hatchling was taken during transit under Terran protection, she declared. We will retrieve our kin. The words were calm. That made them more terrifying. Elias slowly lowered his gaze to the small dragon perched atop his toolbox. It stared back at him. Your royalty, he whispered. The hatchling blinked. There was no arrogance in its expression, no understanding of hierarchy. Only trust. And then, the door to his quarters exploded inward. The blast wave slammed Elias against the wall. Debris and smoke filled the narrow space. Processor alarms shrieked in protest as pressure differentials fluctuated. Through the haze stepped 3 armored figures. Humans. Their armor was matte black with corporate insignias etched across shoulder plates. Logos Elias did not recognize immediately, but he understood the implication. Not Terran Stellar Union. Private contractors. One raised a scanning device, its beam sweeping the room. It locked onto the hatchling instantly. Asset confirmed, the lead mercenary barked. Secure the Drake. Asset. Not child, not hatchling. Asset. The hatchling recoiled, claws scraping against metal. Smoke thickened from its nostrils, coiling upward in defensive instinct. Elias stepped in front of it. He did not think. He did not calculate odds. He simply moved. He was a janitor. He had a mop leaning against the processor wall. And he had memorized every maintenance shaft on this station. The first mercenary lunged forward, restraint field projector, activating with a high-pitched whine. The hatchling moved first. Its chest expanded sharply. A beam of white-hot flame erupted, not wild or chaotic, but narrow and precise. It struck the mercenary's weapon directly. Metal glowed, warped, and collapsed into molten slag within seconds. The mercenary screamed, dropping the ruined device. The armor remained intact. The flame had been controlled. Measured. The second mercenary reacted faster, firing a stun round. The projectile crackled with electromagnetic charge. Elias swung his mop handle with every ounce of strength he possessed, slamming it into a coolant pipe mounted along the ceiling. The pipe ruptured, and pressurized vapor exploded outward in a blinding cloud of supercooled mist. The temperature in the room plummeted instantly, obscuring vision and disrupting targeting sensors. Visibility 0, someone shouted. Elias grabbed the hatchling against his chest, ignoring the heat searing through his shirt, and dove toward the rear wall. There, behind a removable access panel. He kicked it open and squeezed into the maintenance shaft beyond. Boots thundered behind them. After them. The shaft was barely wide enough for Elia's shoulders. He crawled on elbows and knees, clutching the hatchling with one arm while dragging himself forward with the other. Metal scraped skin. The hatchling clung to him instinctively, claws careful not to pierce too deeply. Behind them, the mercenaries struggled to follow in heavy armor. Elias knew these passages. He had spent years navigating them to repair hidden conduits and recalibrate gravity nodes. He knew which junctions were dead ends and which curved unexpectedly into ventilation corridors. He took the left fork at the first split, counterintuitive, narrower, but leading toward gravity stabilizers. The shaft angled downward. The hum of processors grew louder. Heat signature moving, one mercenary shouted behind them. Of course. The hatchling was a beacon. Elias reached a vertical drop and slid down carefully, boots finding footholds along maintenance brackets. The hatchling shifted against him but did not panic. He landed lightly in a secondary conduit passage. Lights flickered overhead. Security forces would be mobilizing now, but they would not know whom to trust. Diplomatic breach meant chaos. He sprinted, left through a waste recycling bypass, right past a decommissioned power relay, up through a ladder shaft seldom used since the last station expansion. Behind him, the mercenaries were closer. A stun round cracked against the wall inches from his head. They burst into a wider junction chamber and stopped. Ahead stood two station security officers, weapons raised. Behind him, mercenaries emerged from the shaft. Trapped. Stand down, one security officer shouted. All personnel drop your weapons. Union authority, the mercenary leader snapped back. Step aside. Lies. Elias could see it in their armor tags, no official Union encryption. The hatchling slipped from his arms and stepped forward. Its small chest expanded. Heat surged outward. But instead of flame, a different force gathered, something deeper, resonant. The air vibrated. A pulse erupted from the hatchling, not fire but harmonic energy. It rippled through the junction in expanding waves. Weapons sparked and died, power cells overloaded, armor servos locked. Lights shattered. Every electronic system in the chamber failed simultaneously. Darkness swallowed them. Except for one system. The emergency beacon. Hardwired. Independent. It activated automatically. And transmitted one signal. Location confirmed. Silence followed. Then, the entire station trembled. Not from internal malfunction. From something enormous exiting subspace directly above the docking ring. Through distant bulkheads, a shadow passed across external viewports. A Varkeshian dread courier had arrived. The High Brood had come for their owns. And Elias Rowe, janitor of New Carthage Station, stood in the dark beside a hatchling who had just summoned dragons from the stars. The janitor who stood before fire. The docking bay doors opened under emergency override with a sound that seemed to split the world in two. Massive locking bolts disengaged in sequence, each one slamming back into its housing with concussive force. Warning klaxons cut off midway as higher authority seized control of the station systems. Hydraulic seals vented atmosphere in controlled bursts, and the inner barrier irised apart like the opening of some colossal mechanical eye. Cold starlight spilled across the deck plating. Beyond the threshold, framed against the distant burn of nebulae and the vast curve of the station's hull, stood dragons. They did not fly in. They walked. Each step rang through the docking bay like the tolling of iron bells. Their claws struck alloy flooring that had been designed to support cargo freighters, and still the deck trembled faintly beneath their weight. Heat rolled ahead of them in shimmering waves, distorting the air. Their scales were not uniform. Some bore the deep basalt black of cooled volcanic stone veined with emberglow. Others shimmered in hues of molten copper, storm gray, and sunlit crimson. Horns curved skyward in proud arcs. Wings folded along their backs like cloaks forged of fire and shadow. Station security personnel instinctively fell back, weapons useless in their powerless grips. The mercenaries who had survived the harmonic pulse lay frozen in armor locked by fried servos, eyes wide behind visors. At the center of the advancing formation walked a figure who commanded the space by presence alone. High Matriarch Sorinth of Varkesh Prime. She was larger than the others, not merely in physical scale but in gravitas. Her scales were a deep, luminous crimson edged in obsidian. Each plate seemed carved from living gemstone. Her wings, folded now, bore faint patterns that glowed like constellations trapped beneath translucent membrane. Her eyes were twin suns. They found the hatchling instantly. The small dragon stood in front of Ilias, its body low but not cowering, protective. Silence fell across the entire docking bay. Not the silence of emptiness. The silence of held breath. The hatchling made a soft chirping sound, high and tremulous, yet unmistakably joyous. It darted forward, claws skittering across the deck with unsteady eagerness. Ilias felt the absence immediately, as if a warmth had left his side. The matriarch lowered her immense head with controlled precision. Her horns dipped toward the deck. When the hatchling reached her, it reared onto its hind legs and pressed its forehead against hers. Contact. A flare of golden light erupted between them. It was not blinding, yet no one could look away. Energy rippled outward in concentric waves, gentle, harmonic, resonant. Ilias felt it brush across his mind, like warm wind carrying distant voices. Memories were exchanged. Truths revealed. In that radiant communion, the hatchling shared everything. The crate, the plasma fire, the human with the mop, the narrow shafts and the shield of a fragile body standing before armed hunters. The golden light dimmed slowly. The hatchling stepped back. The matriarch raised her head. Her eyes shifted. When she turned them toward Ilias, he understood what it meant to stand before a star. The heat radiating from her was not merely thermal, it was ancient. It carried the weight of lineage stretching back to the first dragons who had risen from Varkesh Prime's volcanic seas. It carried memory of wars fought in vacuum, of alliances forged in plasma and honor. Every instinct in Ilias' body screamed at him to kneel. He did not. Not from defiance, but because his legs felt rooted to the deck. You sheltered our blood. The words did not pass through air. They resonated directly inside the minds of every being present, human, dragon, mercenary alike. You defended what was not yours. Ilias swallowed, his throat felt painfully dry. It was hurt, he said. His voice sounded very small in the vastness of the bay. The matriarch took a single step closer. Security forces flinched. The remaining mercenaries trembled openly now, their confidence evaporated beneath the sheer magnitude of her presence. You are not warrior caste, she observed. There was no mockery in the statement, only assessment. No, Ilias admitted, I clean floors. A ripple passed through the gathered dragons. It was not laughter. It was something deeper, a shared pulse of amusement layered with curiosity. You faced armed hunters with a cleaning tool, the matriarch continued. Why? Ilias glanced toward the hatchling, who had returned to stand near his side, brushing lightly against his leg with warm scales. Because it asked, he said. The simplicity of the answer settled over the bay like falling ash. The matriarch regarded him for a long, measuring moment. In that silence, Ilias felt something probing, not invasive but searching. The faint brush of draconic empathic resonance skimmed across his surface thoughts. She was not extracting secrets, she was weighing intent. She found no ambition there. No calculations. Only a tired maintenance worker who had seen something small and frightened and decided that mattered. Slowly, deliberately, the high matriarch Sarinth lowered her massive head. She bowed. The motion was unmistakable. Dragons did not bow lightly. The gesture sent a shockwave through more than the docking bay. Across encrypted diplomatic channels, across military monitoring stations, across political offices light years away, sensors registered the act. Recordings streamed in real time to observers who would replay the footage in disbelief. A dragon matriarch bowing to a human janitor. From this moment, her voice resonated through every mind present. Human Ilias Rowe is flame friend to the high brood of Varkesh Prime. The title carried weight. It was not ceremonial. It was binding. Protection, alliance, an unbreakable debt acknowledged before witnesses. The hatchling chirped proudly, lifting its head higher. Ilias stood there stunned. I didn't, he began. You acted, the matriarch interrupted gently. Without expectation of return, such action shapes worlds. Behind her, one of the elder dragons stepped forward and extended a talon. Within it rested a small shard of crystalline stone, glowing faintly from within. The matriarch nodded toward it. A token, she said, so that all who see you know our bond. Elias hesitated only a second before stepping forward. The dragon placed the shard into his palm. It was warm but not burning. It pulsed once faintly and then settled into steady glow. The light reflected against his skin, casting gold across calloused fingers. Let it be known, the matriarch declared, her voice expanding beyond the bay now, carried through station comms and into orbit, that the High Brood stands with the Terran Stellar Union against those who would fracture trust through treachery. Her gaze shifted toward the immobilized mercenaries. They tried unsuccessfully to shrink beneath it. Within a week, the corporation responsible for the hatchling's abduction would cease to exist. Joint sanctions from the Terran Stellar Union and Varkesh Prime would dismantle their holdings with ruthless efficiency. Contracts revoked, assets seized, executives indicted. The message would be clear across civilized space. You do not steal dragon royalty. You do not threaten their allies. You do not underestimate humans. In the days that followed, diplomatic channels flared with unprecedented activity. Where once negotiations between species had been cautious, edged with suspicion and cultural misunderstanding, now there was momentum. Trust, forged not in boardrooms but in action. Elias attended exactly one formal gathering as Flame Friend. He wore a borrowed suit that fit poorly across his shoulders, cameras flashed, politicians shook his hand, a dragon emissary inclined her head respectfully toward him. He endured it. Then he asked to return to work. Because floors still needed cleaning, and atmospheric processors still required calibration. And invisibility, he found, was easier to navigate than celebrity. The station returned to rhythm. Cargo flowed. Diplomats traveled. Life continued. But something fundamental had shifted. Months later, Elias stood beneath the observation dome with his mop in hand, polishing the transparent alloy to a flawless sheen. Beyond the dome, stars wheeled in silent arcs. A shadow passed overhead. Large, familiar. He glanced up. Outside the dome, perched carefully along the external hull where magnetic clamps met reinforced plating, rested a dragon the size of a shuttlecraft. Its scales gleamed bright copper in starlight. Its wings stretched wide, catching distant radiation like solar sails. It peered down through the dome, golden eyes bright with unmistakable recognition. The hatchling had grown. Rapidly, powerfully, but when Elias lifted a hand in greeting, it tilted its head exactly as it had in his cramped apartment between water recyclers and atmospheric processors. Some things did not change. Inside the station, dignitaries paused mid-conversation as the dragon's silhouette crossed the dome overhead. They knew the story. Every ambassador, every trade envoy, every admiral. They knew that once, a lost dragon hatchling had asked a human janitor for shelter. And he had given it. Not because of politics. Not because of strategy. Because it was hurt. And that simple choice had reshaped the relationship between species who commanded stars. Elias finished polishing the glass and leaned on his mop, watching the young dragon outside. He would never be warrior caste. Never command fleets. Never sit in chambers where treaties were drafted. But he had stood before fire, and fire had bowed. And in quiet corridors of New Carthage Station, long after the headlines faded and the diplomats moved on, a simple truth endured. If a dragon of the High Brood ever needed shelter, it would ask a human. And after that, nothing would ever be the same.